Well, a very warm welcome, everyone, to this, our 21st episode of Moments of Grace. This time, Why God, Why, with Dr. Thomas G. Long. Tom, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Dr. Long is Bandy Professor of Preaching Emeritus at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He is also our guest preacher here coming up at the end of February. Tom is going to be with us on Sunday, February 27th, preaching, and he's also going to be our noonday preacher on Ash Wednesday. Amongst other books that Tom has written, he has, what shall we say? Evil, Suffering, and the Crisis of Faith. We have many copies in our bookstore, our Gifts of Grace. So please do grab a copy of that after listening to our episode today. And a very timely topic, I believe, as Lent is not all of that far away. So Tom and I are going to kind of focus on these kind of issues of evil, suffering, and maybe the great question, why, God, why do these things happen? Tom, I wanted to start, we're currently right now wrapping up a book study on a children's book of all things, The Inquisitor's Tale, which I had never read before. Very good book. But I was struck, it's about two Christian children and one Jewish child traveling around France, and they're being hunted and persecuted for some of the things they're doing. But the little Jewish boy lost his parents in a fire set by Christians of all people. So actually very historically accurate for things that were going on in Europe at that time. But he has this great question of why God, why? How can God, a good God, allow these kind of things to happen? And a wise person gives him an analogy towards the end of the book. And I wanted to quote that analogy and get your opinion on, is it a helpful analogy as we struggle with a good God and evil and suffering in this world? The little boy, Jacob, was counseled with this. Somebody said to him, life is a song, composed and sung by God. We are but characters in his song. Now, Hildebrand doesn't think his song is beautiful. He's either going to kill his son or die himself. It's not beautiful to him at all, but that's because he can't hear it. He's in it. You can't hear a song you're in, right? And Tom, I wonder if you find that a helpful analogy. I'd never thought of it this way before, but a helpful analogy in our struggles in living in a world of evil and suffering with faith and trust in a good God.
Well, thanks for that question. I'm not familiar with that book, but that's a beautiful metaphor that the book has. Let me take a running start at that. The reason I wrote the book, What Shall We Say, I had two motivations for it. One was, I think one of the greatest challenges that thinking Christians face today about their faith is the question of huge suffering in their own lives and the lives of others. What sense can we make of a loving and powerful God who allows such suffering to take place? And every thinking Christian tries to come to some kind of understanding of how this could be. And if that's satisfying, then they can keep going. If it's not, it becomes a faith crisis. The other reason I wrote it is because I think a lot of ministers have developed what I call the position of the theology of presence. That is to say, I don't have any answers to these questions. I'm just present with people as they suffer. And that of course has some value. Nobody wants a lesson when you're standing at an open grave. But the Christian faith does have some ways of thinking about this problem, and I think pastors ought to be aware of those. One of the ways that we have understood this is exactly in the illustration that you gave, that although life seems broken and fragmented and impossible to understand for us, there is a song being sung that is beyond our understanding that makes sense of it. And I want to give a yes and a no to that. On the yes side, I think it is true that the Christian faith places our fragmented, broken lives down into a whole that we, W-H-O-L-E, that we can't create on our own. That's what baptism means. My life is gathered into the life of Jesus. Jesus is the life that's whole and full, and my life takes meaning in that. So there's a yes to that. The no actually comes from Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, where a similar image is used by Thornton Wilder in his book, The Eighth Day. Wilder says, not a song, but life is a tapestry. And we live on the backside of the tapestry. And so we see the broken threads and fragments and knots and ugly pieces. But one day we will be on the other side of the tapestry and we will see it for the beauty that God has made in it. The problem with that is that there are some experiences of suffering that are so irrational, so unuseful, that it's a blasphemy to think that God is weaving these into some beautiful tapestry. If my child dies at 9 months of leukemia, I don't want anybody to tell me, oh, that's just a thread in a tapestry you'll see one day, or that's just a note in a song you can't hear now, but you will hear one day. No, I want some other understanding theologically than this is a good thing when you finally understand it.
I think on that note, I've come over the years to kind of that opinion that we probably can't ever give an answer which has a person walk away and say, okay, that's now all okay. That great tragedy is okay. But more so, I think, is what you're hinting at is how do we continue to live with these things with faith still? Never walking away and going, oh, great, I've got an answer. It's all okay. But how can I continue to struggle in this relationship with a good, loving God?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, Kenneth Surin, one Christian theologian who's addressed this problem, says, the way that we first pose this question to ourselves is a kind of a mathematical problem. There is a God, God is powerful, God is loving, there's suffering. How do you hold those four things together? And he said that's a mathematical philosophical problem, and the only possible solution is a mathematical philosophical God. And Christians don't know such a God. The only God we know is the one you know by walking through life. And as a matter of fact, the most satisfying responses to the problem of suffering have not come by anyone who says, oh, I've got it, I can explain that. They come from people who actually join together with suffering people, who take care of people, parents with Alzheimer's, or children with terrible diseases, or spouses who are suffering. And in walking through that suffering, they see glimpses of a hope that they couldn't have seen otherwise. It's not a solution in the mathematical sense, but it's a way of putting one foot in front of the other for one more day and keeping on the way.
Well, along those lines, I mean, it sounds like you are saying this, but I wonder, are we able to live with some kinds of evil and suffering as we see them in this world without always labeling them as bad, evil, or destructive?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's really important to make distinctions in what we mean by suffering. Paul says in Romans that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Well, that's true about some kinds of suffering. When we form relationships, when we get married, or we get into a partnership, or when we decide to have children, when we take on a deep friendship, any kind of human relationship necessarily carries with it a kind of suffering. I can't be a friend without suffering with and for. But that's not a bad kind of suffering. That's the kind of suffering that deepens the relationship and that builds character in me and creates hope. Paul is absolutely right. But when a tsunami takes out 3 million people in the Indian Ocean, no one learns anything about character in that. That's simply a catastrophic kind of suffering. And I think the scripture doesn't say, well, that builds endurance and that builds character. I think it says, this is my enemy too. That's what God says. This kind of death-dealing suffering is my enemy too.
On that note, and as we are drawing near Lent, and as you will be with us here at the beginning of Lent, I think kind of maybe for our final topic of discussion in this Moments of Grace, is Christ's suffering on the cross unique in all of this? And I ask that in the sense of how can we live with that suffering and actually have it deepen our faith and not unsettle our faith, the suffering of Christ?
Yes, the suffering of Jesus, I would say primarily that it's revelatory, that we are able to see in that things that we could not see. Jesus suffers just as we do, and yet he also suffers as one who is not exactly just like us. He is a unique Son of God. But in the cross, I think we are shown three things, at least three things about suffering. One is God entered into our suffering. Whatever suffering we have, God is participating in it in the cross. God joined the self of God to the suffering of humanity. And the second thing I think we see is that Christian theology has always said that Jesus' death on the cross was not just a sad tale of tragedy, but that in the crucifixion, something was happening. God was in Christ reconciling the world to the self of God, that God was taking on the sin and suffering of the world and redeeming it on the cross. So there was a transformation taking place in the cross. And the third thing I think we can see in the cross is one of the things that creates a problem for us about suffering is we want God to rend the heavens and come down with a sword and a chariot and put an end to suffering. But that actually imposes on God our human understanding of power. And the cross is God's definition of power. The cross was where God was the most powerful in the world, but it was the place where God looked to be the least powerful.
Yeah, you've just reminded me of my boyhood wish sitting in church and hearing the crucifixion story every year. And that was when Jesus was challenged to come down from the cross. I was convinced one of those years the reading was going to change and he was going to fly off the cross with the nails in his hand and do whatever a 8-year-old boy would want the Son of God to do to those taunting him. But indeed, that's not how the story goes.
That's right. And the same thing with the resurrection. You would think that he would go to the Sanhedrin as the risen Christ and say, you want to go another round? But no, he appears only to those who already trust him. It's a power and weakness.
Absolutely. And I think as you hinted at there as well, one of the great things that I've latched onto over the years, sitting with people in their suffering, is this whole idea that we assume God is absent in suffering. But actually, maybe the cross shows us that God is maybe not most fully, but absolutely present in suffering.
That's right. That's that first revelation to us that God participates in our suffering, and that's why people who work in a home for children who are suffering, or who minister to homeless people, or who take on in some way the suffering of the world, will catch glimpses of the risen Christ in that ministry, and will be given hope that God is indeed bringing about that place where every tear will be dried and suffering and pain will be no more.
Tom, thank you so much for joining us today on this Moments of Grace.
My pleasure.
Are very much looking forward to having you present with us at the end of February and going into the beginning of March. Any closing words for us as we close off here, but look forward to seeing you in person?
No, I feel the same way. I'm really looking forward to being with your congregation there at Grace, and to trying to proclaim the gospel in a very challenging time in our country's life.
Well, we look forward to it, our time together, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Bryce.